I want to start today's podcast with a line that has stayed with me for a long, long time. It goes, I want and I choose what better leads to the deepening of God's life in me.
How we gonna overcome these times?
This line, it comes from St. Ignatius of Loyola. And the first time I truly heard it, not just read it, but heard it, I had to put it down and sit with it for a while. It is, I've come to believe, a philosophy of decision-making and a veritable compass. It has been one of the most useful things I have carried into the hardest hours of my life. The ones that arrive at 2 a.m., uninvited, and don't leave when the sun comes up. Most of us were taught, if not directly, then by inheritance, that decisions come in two varieties: right and wrong, good and bad. The moral life, we were told, was largely a matter of courage, the courage to choose good over evil when the moment demanded it. And that's sometimes true. Some decisions really are between right and wrong. And in those moments, however difficult, a kind of clarity is available to us if we're honest enough to go looking for it. But I want to talk about a different category because I think it's here that most of life's real weight actually lives. Not in the obvious moral tests, but somewhere quieter and far more common. These are the decisions between two legitimate goods. Not good versus evil, good versus good. Two paths, and neither of them wrong. Two versions of a life, each holding something real, something worth having. The job that pays the bills, and the calling that doesn't yet. The relationship that is comfortable, and the one that is alive. The staying that is safe, and the leaving that is honest. If you've ever stood at that particular crossroads, and I suspect most of you have, more than once, you already know that no pros and cons list gets you all the way there. No well-meaning advice from a friend closes the distance. And no amount of turning it over at 2 a.m, running the numbers again, rehearsing the arguments one more time, actually resolves it. Because the answer isn't only in your head. It lives somewhere deeper than reasoning can reach on its own. The Ignatian tradition has a name for this deeper compass. That is, the magi, from the Latin, the more. Not more in the sense of ambition, not more in the sense of acquiring, achieving, accumulating. The kind of more our culture is fluent in and exhausted by. More in the sense of orientation, a direction, not a destination. Which of these two goods leads more fully toward love? Which opens more completely toward service, toward the life you're meant to give, not just the life you're meant to have? Which brings you near, not to comfort, not to the approval of the people watching, not to a version of security that photographs well, but doesn't hold, but to the life you were actually made for. Now, I suspect some of you are thinking, because I have thought it too, more than once, standing in my kitchen at an hour I won't name, and it goes, well, that sounds beautiful, but rent is real, stability is real, and the fear of ending up with nothing, especially for those of us maybe who have already lost something significant, who have worked hard, quietly and for years, to rebuild what fell apart. That fear is not weakness. It is the oldest human struggle there is. And it deserves to be taken serious rather than argued with. There's a moment in the Gospels I think of here. The disciples, at a certain point, turn and ask a plain, almost embarrassed question. We've left everything to follow you. So what happens to us now, Jesus? I like this moment because the disciples are not being faithless. They're being human. They had families, they had trades, boats, a way of making a living they understood. They were standing at the edge of something that made no rational sense. And they asked the only honest question a person in that position has available to them. Will this be all right? We don't need to be ashamed of that question. I've asked it more times than I can count, in more forms than I could list. And the answer, whatever shape it takes in a given life, is rarely a guarantee. It's almost always an invitation instead, which is a much harder thing to be handed than a promise, and much more, and a much truer one. Trusting that provision will come feels on certain days indistinguishable from magical thinking. And I understand that feeling intimately. I've sat inside it. But here's what I've come to believe. Not from certainty, because I don't have much of that to offer, but from experience, which is a slower and more reliable teacher. Trust is not the absence of fear. It is not a serene confidence that everything will resolve exactly as we hope. It is something quieter than that, and far more demanding. Trust is the willingness to choose the better good, and then to bring absolutely everything we have to it. Our intelligence, our experience, every hard-won lesson from every difficult season we have already survived and are still in some way carrying. Trust is not passivity. It is not waiting for a sign while the days quietly drain away, one after another, until the decision has been made for us by default. It is the active, daily, sometimes hourly decision to orient ourselves toward the more, toward the deepening of God's life in us, and then to work with everything we have in that direction. There's something else I think we don't say plainly enough, and I want to say it here. Staying has a cost too. We tend to frame these decisions as risk versus safety. the leap versus the sure thing, the unknown versus the familiar. But that framing, however comforting, is quietly dishonest because it assigns all the risk to movement and none to stillness. As if standing still were free, as if the ground beneath the familiar choice never shifted, never asked anything of us, and never charged a rent of its own. That is not how life works. A person who remains for years inside conditions that prevent them from creating, from working at their full capacity, from becoming who they are clearly meant to become, that person is spending something, not money perhaps, but time, which does not refund itself, energy, which does not restore it on its own schedule, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, belief in what they are actually capable of, which erodes far more easily than we would like to admit, and is far harder to rebuild once it's gone. Stagnation has a cost. It's simply slower and quieter than the cost of change, which is exactly why it's so easy to overlook and so easy to mistake for peace. The risk of staying is every bit as real as the risk of going. It is only less visible. It doesn't announce itself by the way a leap does, with all its drama and its witnesses. It just accumulates unremarked in a life that keeps deferring. So the real question is never security versus risk. Both paths carry risk. There's no door in this life marked safe. The only honest question, the one actually worth losing sleep over, is this: which risk is oriented towards life? I want to return to where we began because I think the line deserves one more look now that we've walked around it a while. I want and I choose what better leads to the deepening of God's life in me. Notice what it doesn't say. It doesn't say, I choose what is safest. I choose what is most comfortable. I choose what makes the most sense on paper to the people who will ask me about it at dinner, or I choose what everyone I love thinks I should do. It says, I choose what leads to the deepening, what makes me more fully alive, more fully myself, more fully the person I was made to become. Not a better performing version of who I already am, but someone genuinely closer to the source. And in each of those hard moments, the ones where two real or relative goods are pulling against each other, where you cannot sleep and you can't think your way out, the question was never, is this good or bad? It is, between these two legitimate paths, which one orients my life towards the more, toward love, toward service, toward whatever most alive and most true in me, even if it is also the harder road. In closing, this is not a framework that requires certainty. It doesn't ask for the absence of fear or doubt, and it doesn't demand you have the whole path mapped out before you take the next step, which is a mercy, I think, because almost none of us ever do. Again, it asks only for the willingness, honest, daily, sometimes hourly, to choose towards the more. And then to trust. Not that everything will be easy, not that the path will be straight or the outcome guaranteed, because it rarely is either of those things, but that life genuinely oriented toward love and toward service is never entirely without ground beneath it. Even when you cannot see that ground, even when it feels on certain days like there is no ground there at all, that is where faith actually lives. Not in certainty, not in having arrived, but rather in the choosing over and over, one ordinary day at a time.